Welcome back. We've been looking at the letter of James. This is the second presentation in this series. He wrote his letter to little groups of followers of Jesus. They had been Jews and had come to know Jesus and were serving Jesus. But they were under pressure, economic pressure. Life was hard, and he writes to advise them. In those days, Christians were regarded by the Roman authorities as just a sect of Judaism and treated with the same disdain. And indeed, the Roman authorities were starting to persecute people who didn't worship the Roman emperor, trying to bring cohesiveness to the great sprawling empire under Rome. While at the same time, these little groups of followers of Jesus from a Jewish background were being persecuted by the Jews whom they had left. So they're being got at from both sides. And that was tough to survive that. And we saw how often that still happens today. It's happening in Palestine at this very moment, and it's happened over many decades, where Christian Palestinians were just regarded as part of the Palestinian group and potential terrorists. That's how the Jews looked at them. But at the same time, the Muslim Palestinians were putting pressure on them to bankrupt them. They were being oppressed from two sides. Chapter 1. We have to read this as a complete unit. James is addressing that kind of a question. How do we react when we're oppressed on every side? Where we wonder whether we shall cope. That's very human. And at times we wonder why God allows it to happen. Why won't you step in and do something about it, we cry. And sometimes we even think that God has sent the troubles and the problems to teach us some kind of a lesson. There are times when things become so hard. We become angry. We want to retaliate. Life is so unjust, and we're treated so badly. And that leads us to start to say things that express that anger and frustration. These are some of the ways in which we can react when we're under oppression, persecution, when life is tough, and we don't know whether we're going to get through. And what James says is that God doesn't send the trials, but he can turn them to our advantage. He calls that maturity. If we want to know why it's happening in the way it is, God will answer that question. He will explain, and he will show us what's happening in the spiritual realm. But we've got to ask him. James calls that wisdom. And God never sends trials and problems to make life miserable for us. That's never his way. God is love. God sends good gifts. The trials and the oppressions come from those who are rebelling against God and getting at us. And retaliation, that was never the way of Jesus. And it should not be our way either. Jesus faced total injustice in his capture, in his trial, and in his execution under torture. And James describes that as righteousness, living God's way. And we need to control what we say. And James develops that further later. And let God's ways shine through, no matter what the oppression and the injustice that's fired at us. That's living God's ways. James gives us a positive picture of positive steps we can take to help us through the difficult times. In chapter 1, verse 20, he says that human anger when we explode with the injustices fired at us, with the experiences which are so unfair, the natural desire to be angry and retaliate, that does not produce the righteousness that God desires. That's what James says. So no matter what trials face us, and some of them may be totally unfair, the injustices that are forced on us, and we're beginning to see just the edges of that in the West with political correctness bringing total injustice to the people of God. No matter how unfair life is, and life can be extremely unfair, these are the words that James gives to us. And the model and the answer is Jesus. Think of how Jesus handled it. He didn't retaliate in that overnight illegal trial. He didn't retaliate with the Roman representative Pilate. He didn't retaliate against those who tortured him publicly to death on the cross. He said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." We have to ask God for the resources to make that possible, because humanly it is impossible. Now let's move on into chapter 2. Chapter 1 has looked at how do we cope with this economic oppression. There are many signs in the book that show that, or indicate that it is primarily economic. These people had come to Jesus from a Jewish background, and they were finding life very hard. Perhaps their businesses were being boycotted. Perhaps they've been driven out. How do they feed their families? How do they just survive? Chapter 2 looks at our attitudes to wealth and to people. And that in the context of being under persecution or oppression. At that time, many thought that if you had wealth and possessions, well, that was a sign of God's favour. You'd been super good, therefore God had given you these things. That still happens today. Not quite using God, but a kind of favour. And look at the system in India, where those who in the higher levels can oppress those at the lower levels, because those who have the wealth, the status, the possessions, they'd earned it, a sign of some kind of spiritual favour. But it can happen in the West. And there is a real danger today, and you can see it sometimes in media reports, sometimes with people being interviewed. Danger of blaming those who have not, and we blame them for having not, as if it's their fault. Now, of course, sometimes, if we're idle, well, we don't deserve to have. We don't work hard, if we don't use the gifts God has given us. But the vast majority of the have-nots have not, simply because of how they were born, the situation into which they were born, and the opportunities that were there for them. We don't blame them. That's a danger. It was then. It is in many parts of the world today. And it is there in the West. James addresses that head on. That is simply not the way of Jesus. So let's look at chapter 2, the first 13 verses. My brothers and sisters, James writes, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there or sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbour as yourself, you're doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin, and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, "You shall not commit adultery," also said, "You shall not murder." If you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you become a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. James sets up a picture, an imaginary picture. But how much this is in our societies today. Discrimination, hierarchy, elitism, the in-group, the important people, the ruling classes. And discrimination on the basis of wealth involves wrong human judgments. Indeed, discrimination on any of these things involves wrong human judgments. For all of us are of equal value before God and are answerable to God. You see, that's what happens. We've got to see people as of equal value before God and not look at the outward appearance. And those with power, those with money, the ruling classes, those who take the decisions, in God's eyes, the person who is nothing is of equal value as a human being. Unity and equality, important. You see, it directs the way we speak. It directs the way we treat the marginalized, who may be marginalized for no fault of their own. It directs the way we treat the poor, not patronizing, but recognizing that we could be in the same boat if we'd been born into their circumstances. And it influences how we think and relate to others. Very practical. We are all of equal value before God. That doesn't mean to say that we're all the same. It doesn't mean to say that we're all achieve the same things or are capable of the same things. But as human beings, we're of equal value. That's God's judgment, because we are all made in God's image. Therefore, we must treat everybody in the light of that. Now that takes a bit of pondering through, because it affects the way we treat people in the ordinary things of life. The people who in their ordinary jobs are there to serve us. They're just doing a job. And they are made in God's image as we are. We're all equal before God. And James goes on. He speaks about the poor and the rich. It was a big divide in his day. It's a big divide today, and very often it's still getting wider. Because of political decisions, the gap between the rich, the people at the top, and the people at the bottom, the top 10%, the bottom 10%, seems to get ever wider. It's stacked against the poor. And yet Jesus knew that. He taught it. Look at Matthew 5. James teaches the same thing. Those who have not so very often respond to Jesus more easily. And in God's kingdom, they inherit everything. James says it. Jesus said it. It's all throughout the New Testament writing. In God's kingdom, we're all equal in status. Jesus did it for us. And as children of God, adopted into God's family, we inherit the wealth of our Heavenly Father. And let's remember this. In the law courts, in all the structures of our modern day society, the poor, those who have not, they're not in a position to go oppressing people. It's those with wealth and money who do it, because they can buy the best lawyers, the best resources. They can buy the researchers to bring up the evidence. The poor can't do that. And that's what's happening today. But it happened brutally in the days when James was writing. And sadly, that's true. If you have a lot, you can often not sense any need. You've done it, even if you've never done anything, you've inherited it. Even if just life has given you this richness and this wealth, you can depend on it. We could summarize it that way. Wealth is not wrong. Earning a lot isn't necessarily wrong at all. The danger is that the wealth gives us a sense of power, a sense that we've made it, a sense that we're better than the others, a deep sense of self-sufficiency. We don't need help, we can do it, we can buy the help when we need it. And so often that cuts us off from responding to Jesus. And so many reject Jesus. And they use their power, their wealth, their access to the media to misrepresent all that he is and has done. And the poor get oppressed as a result. Earning money can be really good. Earning a lot of money can be really good. But there are dangers in it. And perhaps the message, though James doesn't go as far as this, the more we earn, perhaps it should be the more we give away for the benefit of others. Let's look at the second half of this section. The word sin is there. Now that's not a fashionable word in our modern language today. You could describe it that way. It's a tendency within us all to desire and to choose to do things that we simply know in the depth of our being are not good. We've set off in life, on the arrow of life. There's a target that we've to hit. And we're not even going to get to the target, little less the bullseye, because we've chosen another way. And what James is saying is that, and we've got to remember he was writing in the 1st century, in the thought forms of the culture of his day. But that's what he's saying in modern language. Favoritism is just as bad as adultery or murder, for all break the law of love. If we start to adulate and bow down and do special things for those who have money, resources, those who've got to the top of some empire, those who've been particularly successful at something, yes, we can respect them, yes, we can admire. But favoritism, they're just human beings like us all. We're all equal before God. There are some fundamental key principles in all of this. The law was given in the days of Moses as a set of directions for living. It was never given as a kind of rule book so that we could earn our way into God's favour. It was a positive set of directions for a desert rabble escaping from Egypt. How were they going to live? The cultures round about lived by very different standards. How were they going to live? And God gave them a set of directions to make life rich and good. That was its purpose. And why not just pick what we like and push aside what we don't like? Because favoritism is just as bad as adultery or murder. And in the Jewish system that Moses set up, the Day of Atonement, it recognized that failure was going to happen and provided a way that people could recognize it and seek God's forgiveness. They would mess up, but when Jesus came, he fulfilled the law. He lived the quality of life that's God's. He lived it to the full. If you look at his life, the life was that of simple quality. But he also became the sacrifice, the final sacrifice, fulfilling the Day of Atonement and releasing us from the consequences of our repeated failures. That's some of the key principles underpinning this. And James refers to the law as a law of freedom. We don't think of laws that way, but if you think about it for a moment or two, you realize that laws in any sense bring freedom. In any country, if we didn't have laws, then people wouldn't be protected. They wouldn't be free to go about their own business. They wouldn't even be safe to cross a road for fear a car would come along 80 miles an hour and mow them down. The laws bring freedom. That's a simple truth. They're not designed to be restrictive. Don't do this, don't do that, that are irrational. That's religion. The laws of God are positive sets of direction to enable us to live more and more fully. It's a positive framework, not negative. And it allows us to fulfill our potential in our own communities. If you just ponder the kind of laws, the kind of regulations that govern our modern lives today, they can be seen in that positive way. If you simply take the fact that in most cultures murder is something which is prohibited, and think how that brings us freedom. Freedom to live our lives knowing that people are not there all the time waiting to wipe out our lives if it suits them, without it there being any consequences. The law brings freedom, brings fulfillment, and it releases us. It allows us the possibility to live life to the full. Now that enhances and enriches our whole concept of how Jesus fulfilled the law, because he releases to us a positive framework for living in security, and he gives us the directions so that we can live lives that are rich and satisfying, whether we are rich or poor. The last little phrase is an interesting one. Mercy triumphs over judgment. I put it this way: mercy, caring for others who are in any way disadvantaged. And rejecting any idea of judging others by outward appearances. Very, very deep and important principles for us today. Throughout the Bible, the concept of equality is very, very strong. And in our society, wealth, status, possessions, and all kinds of human abilities, none of these are signs of God's favoritism or human superiority. We can rejoice and celebrate when someone is wonderfully successful in some way. But that does not indicate that God has given them some kind of favored position or that they're in some way superior. Equality is central to the way of Jesus. Now let's move on to the second part of the chapter. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is that? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds." You believe there's one God. Good. But remember, even the demons believe that, and they shudder. Faith and actions are related. This is an area where people have found this section difficult to get their heads around. And we'll look at that in a moment or two. But the point here is, faith is not directly observable. It's inside you, or not inside you, as the case may be. Faith is decisions you make within yourself. What you can see is the output, the outcome from these decisions. That they are directly observable, and they're observable in the way we treat each other. That's a central principle. Let's look at this word faith a bit more. So often misunderstood. So often in our world today we have reduced the word faith to mean believing that certain things are true. People say, "My faith won't let me," and they come up with things that they believe are true. So often what they're believing is true is undermined by all the objective evidence. That's not the way the word was used in the New Testament days. That's what the word really means. Responding to what God has done for us in Jesus. Now that's a New Testament interpretation. But that's what the original word means. The original word faith is not essentially a word of mental assent. It's a word of response. It's a word of action. It's a word of doing. Now let's carry that in mind. You see, you can believe all sorts of things are true, and these things may or they may not affect your lifestyle. Believe A, B, C, sign here, you're in. The way of religion. But that may or may not affect the lifestyle, because that's in the mind. This is different. And that's the real meaning of the word in the original language. It's a sense of committing, action, committing ourselves to act in response to whatever God has done, his initiative. That's the real sense of the word faith in the original. Let's look at 3 religions. In Judaism, central belief statements: God is one, we are to love God and love others. And in the Old Testament sense, through to AD 70, there was a sacrificial system. And when they messed up, trust God to accept you. The sacrificial system has gone. In Christianity, God is one, love God, love others. But there's one real big difference. Jesus makes it possible. He makes it possible by what he did in his life, death, and resurrection. He invites us into God's kingdom. He makes it possible for us in his kingdom by releasing the resources by his Holy Spirit so that we can love God and love others. Our response is we accept what Jesus has done, but we have to act and draw our resources from him to serve others. That's action. That's faith. In Islam, there is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. Say that in front of witnesses, you become a Muslim. It's entirely intellectual. It's a belief statement. And then when you've said it, you've got to learn the rule book based on the Quran and the Hadith, enshrined in Sharia law, interpreted by reputable Islamic scholars, and you obey it. You don't ask questions. The three things are very different. You see, accepting belief statements in any religion, it's a waste of time. They've got to work out in practical living and the way we treat each other. And we have to look at the way people treat each other, because that's the basis of making any judgment about the validity of the belief statements. With that background in mind, let's go back to chapter 2 towards the end. When James says this, you foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Wasn't it our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone. Abraham believed God. You find that in Genesis 15. The word believe there is the same word as faith. It's just the verb. Abraham responded to the words of God, the commands of God, the direction of God, and God accepted Abraham because he responded. He did. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Rahab the prostitute. In the Hebrew, probably the word that's been translated prostitute means innkeeper. But James would have access to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, where it was transliterated across into the Greek for the word prostitute. But it's probably better to think of Rahab being the innkeeper in Jericho. You see, Abraham heard God and he took action. He just didn't sit about and recite mantras and say, I believe this, this, and this. God told him to do something, and his whole life was an experience of that. Yes, he made mistakes, but throughout his life he heard God. And then he took action. It wasn't just in the brain. And God accepted Abraham because Abraham was responding to God. God could continue to speak to Abraham and work through him and his family. Rahab was exactly the same. If you like, she was at the bottom of the social heap. The innkeeper, or could be prostitute, but more likely innkeeper. She heard God and of his reputation. Her knowledge of God was very limited, but she took action. She saved the lives of the spies, and that allowed Jericho to be taken by Joshua. Jericho was an army fortress, not a city with lots of people in it. And Rahab's life was spared. So was her family. You see, she took action. And if you look at Hebrews 11, the great chapter of faith, in every case, just read it through, in every case it says, had faith and the person did something. You see, faith is not just mental assent. It's not just agreeing with propositions. That's the point that James is making. We've got a problem with this word faith. Blindly accepting what we're told is true. That's what religions do, but it's not unique to religions. You'll find it in all sorts of philosophical and political systems as well. You must look at the evidence. There is no place for blind accepting what you're told is true. Look at the evidence. Mentally accepting a set of tenets. God is one and Muhammad is his prophet. Well, many religions do that, including sections of Christianity. Believe A, B, C, sign here, you're in. The evangelical mantra. That's the true meaning of the word. And if it doesn't show out in the way we act, it's not real within us. That's the biblical picture. I pointed out that some people have built a controversy between Paul and James. Paul emphasizes the central place of faith. And what Paul is saying is that none of us is good enough to earn God's acceptance. We can't win God's favor. We can't impress God by our self-effort, by keeping the rule book. We listen to God. We respond to him. That's faith. And he releases to us acceptance when we're willing to do it. James? What James is saying is that when we respond to God, it must show in what we do. Faith is not just a mental thinking process. Our response to God must issue in action. Now, the controversy between the two is entirely apparent. And the difficulty is caused because we read back our modern Western understandings into the biblical text. For example, we've never looked at the word faith as it would be understood by the original hearers. Because faith in the original languages, both Hebrew and Greek, is not primarily mental assent. It is response. It is action. Very often we come to biblical texts with preconceived ideas. They may be given to us through theological colleges, through our churches, or maybe through anti-Christian views. And we don't take the time to understand why Paul and James spoke as they spoke. They dictated their letters. That was the fashion of the day. We're working in a spoken culture, not a written culture. Very few could read and write. Fundamental principles. We look at the text and say, what does it actually say? Strip away our previous ideas. When was it spoken? Where was it spoken? To whom was it spoken? And why did the person say it that way? And the most fundamental question to ask of all is, how would the original hearers have got it? Because that gives us the clue of the significance for it today. These are fundamental principles of looking at any book. And so often we rip things out of the Bible, westernize it, put on our preconceived ideas, and then become dogmatic. And we end up with all kinds of problems. Let me try to summarize this as I bring it to a conclusion. Paul was writing very often to non-Jewish readers. He's often described as the apostle to the Gentiles. Gentile just means non-Jewish. And they were being pressurized by the Jewish people who were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, that if you wanted to follow God, you've got to follow the Jewish law. In other words, it's self-effort. James was writing to Christians from a Jewish background, and they were in danger of reducing the way of Jesus to some kind of intellectual assent because of their background. And Paul and James knew each other. They had met several times, and despite what some people might think, if you look at the biblical text and you look at the extra outside biblical evidence, they held a respect for each other. They weren't trying to stir up controversies. They were addressing different issues with different audiences in a different context. And what they were saying is totally consistent. That's what Paul says. And if you think about it, the idea of any of us being good enough to impress God and win God's favour by our own self-effort, by keeping a rule book, that's laughable. It saddens me to see in some churches all kind of rituals and performances and activities that have got to be gone through, and the impression is left with the people, often by the priestly system, that you've got to do this, otherwise God will not be pleased and you won't get your meal ticket to heaven. But you see it most vividly in the systems of Islam, where keeping the rule book laid down by the reputable Islamic scholars is absolutely central, and all kinds of social pressures are put upon you to make sure you do keep it. God is the Lord of glory. To think that any of us by our self-effort could impress him, win our meal ticket to heaven or paradise, that is laughable. James was saying that. Faith is not just intellectual acceptance. Faith means responding action, and indeed the word means that in the original languages. They were reducing it to intellectual acceptance in the days of James. We've done exactly the same today. Believe this, believe that, believe the other, and you're part of us. You're not part of the group down the road. That's not what faith is about. It's not blindly believing things for which there is no evidence. Faith means responding to God. And that shows in how we treat each other, how we behave. So what Paul then is saying, if self-effort isn't going to win, acceptance before God is in responding to what God has done for us in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. He focuses on that specific and central principle. There's no other way. And you can't combine that with self-effort, because what you're saying is that what Jesus did for us is not quite good enough. And that's what in churches we've done, sadly. We've devalued all that Jesus has done for us in his life, death and resurrection by putting in rules. Keep them, perform this ritual in this way, this time, led by this person, using these words. God's pleased, it's right. Paul hammers that. James is addressing a different issue. Real faith. The same faith that Paul had. It's responding to what God is saying, yes. And that issues and the evidence for it shows in a decision to act. That means we do things. Our behavior changes. And the case that James is using here is, we don't treat the rich with favoritism and put the poor down. They address two different problems, and what they're saying is entirely consistent. And both of them see Abraham as the best example of real faith, Paul refers to Abraham specifically in a section in Romans. James refers to Abraham here, mentions Rahab to show another example. Abraham heard God, and he set off with his family, servants, and his flocks, because he had considerable wealth. And he travelled over a mountain range into a land he didn't know where he was going or what he was going to, but he went south because God told him to. And he entered the land that's today the land of Israel-Palestine. And throughout his life, Abraham heard God saying things. He didn't always get it right, but Abraham heard God. And he responded, and it showed in what he did. And that's the point that James is making. And responding to God is the key to coming into God's kingdom, the kingdom that Jesus came to bring in. And our security and our freedom and our future rests in that. That's what Paul's saying. And the two are consistent. I want us to finish by looking at some great truths. That's the way of religion, all religion. Doesn't work, cannot work. And if in your church group there are things that are being imposed upon you that you've got to do in a certain way, led by a certain person, resist it. That's not the way of God. God took the initiative. He came in Jesus. Jesus brought the truth, the word of truth, showed us what God really was like. We can have a clean, fresh start, the first fruits of all He created. That's God's way. And faith is our response to all that God has done for us in Jesus. He did it for us. He invites us into His kingdom. There are no entry conditions except wanting to come in. But our response is inward, but it's expressed in our changed attitudes and lifestyle. And that's the evidence of your response. Ponder it through carefully.